This video is for English 203. Right now what I want to do is I want to take a look at what kind of intertwines video games and science fiction together. And so I've compiled a list of 6 games that I think very well exemplify what video games and science fiction can do when meshed together. There's no real one definition for where gaming started. You can look back to the 1940s and 50s and find some form of electronic gaming of some kind, but generally agreed upon the first real computer video game was a game called Space War from 1962. It was a very simplistic game. I mean, it was a hobbyist sort of thing. In 1962, you couldn't get a computer just sitting on your desk at home. You had to, you had to go to a major university to play it, and that's how this game was started. It's a basic space shooter. And, coming out in 1962, this was during the time of the space race. John F. Kennedy had made the, we choose not to go because they are easy, but we do these things because they're easy, but because they are hard. And, in relation to going to the moon, the 1960s were dominated by the Cold War and the space race. I think that was on a lot of people's minds. And also, it's very, very easy to make a sort of space scene into a video game. It was very simplistic, Space War was, but it was the first. And I think you kind of have to be simplistic at the start. Of course, this never really went anywhere. It was never released for any sort of consumer or anything like that, but it's still an interesting thing to look at as the first computer video game being a science fiction game. So 1982 brought us, we're jumping into the 80s here, Empire Strikes Back. One of the first games, not the first game, there was the Raiders of the Lost Ark, I believe, came out before this. And there was like a Superman and a Spider-Man game before this on the Atari VCS, but Empire Strikes Back was one of the first adaptations of a film into video games, certainly one of the first adaptations of a science fiction film into a video games. And actually, one of the more interesting trends of video games in the 80s is you started to see more of these adaptations, and this was one that actually really got that idea right. It was, you're flying around in a little ship and you're shooting at the walkers from Star Wars. And it's all very simplistic. It's all one screen, only one enemy, effectively. There's some little things that come in and kind of spice the game up. You have the, if there's a dot on one of the walkers that you shoot, it immediately goes down, stuff like that. It's really a more complex game than I think a lot of the games of the time. This was about 5 years into the Atari, so people had really started to figure out how to actually make this machine, more powerful than you would think at the start of it. But Empire Strikes Back was an important game for video games just because it was one of the first real, it was something more than you would see on the Atari up to that point. I mean, that's absolutely valuable. And to see it come from a franchise such as Star Wars, which has stuck around with video games. I can't think of a major video game console that hasn't had a Star Wars game in there somewhere. And this was, not the first. There was the arcade, the vector graphic arcade game, and I believe there was like a couple of more games on the Atari VCS that were Star Wars themed. This was the first really majorly successful one, and it's actually really influential for games in years to come. If you want to talk influence, influence can be a two-way street. You can be influential but not be successful, and I think the most major game that could kind of exemplify that is based off of a science fiction film, another adaptation, kind of almost the exact opposite of what Empire Strikes Back did for the medium, and that was E.T. the Extraterrestrial of 1983. Very successful game sales-wise, but critically complete failure, considered to be one of the worst games of all time. I don't think I have to say that more than once. And while it was unsuccessful, it was still important because that was the game where I think we figured out that you couldn't just put anything out and expect people to buy it. Major investors kind of figured out that you weren't going to just be able to put, to put garbage out and buy that and expect the public to want it, so they dropped out, and it really kind of centralized all of video games into this is going to be for a certain type of person who wants to play video games, rather than it just being like, you know, you weren't seeing the Parker Brothers, you know, Purina wasn't going to make a game, or Coca-Cola or whoever. And I mean, these are actual games that came out on the Atari after this game came out, because it stopped being a fad in the United States once games like this came out and were failures. And it really did kind of hurt the market for a couple of years, but it ended up coming back stronger than ever. So yeah. So we hit the 1990s, and 1993 I think is one of the first major shifts in video game history, where games became something, I think, a little bit more. The 93 was Myst, which was a hugely successful PC game, and the complete antithesis, in fact the creators of this game despised Myst, was Doom, from id Software of the same year, 1993. Also a PC game, and easily one of the most important video games of the time, if only for the reason that it defined the first-person shooter genre, which eventually became the most successful genre in all of video games. And the reason behind that, was just because this game hit everything that you would want. It was this weird, I won't even say weird, it was actually kind of a natural sort of combination of science fiction. You were going to Mars and you were a space marine, and religious horror, where, you know, in the second episode of the game, you know, it was a freeware game, there's all this different economical stuff with it that was innovative as well, but you go into hell for the rest of the game, basically. And it's just it's an interesting story, it's a really compelling world, and it's a well-made game as well. So it had all of those aspects going together, and with that there was multiplayer, and there's this huge marketing campaign behind it. It was all word of mouth too. It was, you could buy the first episode for free, just get a floppy disk of it back then, and that was just something completely unheard of. Well, maybe not unheard of, but a game like Doom was completely there was nothing like it before, and it really did change everything. I don't think there's been a game since that has completely changed the genre, or completely defined video games since. So that's absolutely impactful, if nothing else. For the mid-90s, I looked to 1996 for two games, and a series that's popping up again, because this is actually one of the first instances where video games really affected what else was going on in the world, and I look at Star Wars Dark Forces, and a little bit more actually at Shadows of the Empire. Two games made by LucasArts. For Dark Forces was a PC that became PlayStation, Shadows of the Empire was purely N64. And both of those games were put out at a time where there was kind of a vacuum between the sixth movie, Return of the Jedi. There were like some kids' cartoons or something between then, and, you know, novels and stuff like that came out. But Star Wars had lain, you know, dormant between, I think, 83 and whenever 99 was the remake, Phantom Menace, and there was like remakes at some point in the 1990s. But a game that came out to kind of gauge the American, or I guess just the global public's response towards Star Wars. I mean, Star Wars just had another film come out yesterday, or today, I guess technically, for when I'm recording this, and it's interesting to see that when you look back to 1996, there hadn't been anything. Shadows of the Empire was an example of a game, and this was a cross-media kind of thing. They had a game, and I think a graphic novel and a regular novel and all that sort of stuff in there. It was gauging the interest in Star Wars and using the sales of that video game. I mean, it was one of the most important games of the first year of the N64, and well-deserved. It's actually a very good game to kind of show that games could show that the public was interested in something. And I mean, every Star Wars games have always been successful, so it's another example of how games could kind of affect the future. We go to 2007 for the next one, a game that I think got overlooked like initially, but as the year went on, 2007 was a really weird year for video games. 2007 was a weird year in general, but when Portal came out, it was part of a package of 5 games. It was the orange box, it was the 3 episodes of Half-Life 2 and Team Fortress 2, and Portal was like this original game that had just kind of come out of nowhere. And what Portal did was it took I think the best way anyone's ever explained Portal to me was it took a story that would really only be great in video games, and it made a great game around it. It was something that I don't think Portal would be as compelling of a game, or it wouldn't be as compelling as a film if you weren't figuring this all out yourself, if you weren't being the one uncovering this. There were games that did this beforehand. I talked about Myst earlier. I think that's a good example of a game like that, but Portal did this in such an effective way with so many memorable characters. I mean, there's only one character. I guess that's all disputed. It was all just so much world in such a little game. And it was all sci-fi based, and it was dystopian, but it was a good sort of like comedic dystopian almost that you don't see from anywhere really that well, at least not done as well as Portal did. And I think that's absolutely one of the most important sci-fi games because it brought the medium into something new. I think it showed the medium really what it could be.
You